Good evening, and welcome to the 15th episode of our Hearthstone Half Hour. I'm Hammy from felcraft.org, and this evening we are going to be going through the fresh January 2014. Today is the 13th of January. Happy New Year, if I haven't caught you in a new year. And the CM over in the US for Hearthstone has just announced another new set of card and balance changes to some pretty staple Hearthstone cards that you see in a bunch of decks. So what we're going to do here is go through what those changes are. I've got them all listed up in an article on felcraft.org, so you can read them in your own time. But from a new player perspective, there'll be something here for new players and something here for intermediate and advanced players as well. For you intermediate and advanced players, it's more just getting the information. For the new players, there'll also be a bit of context as to, you might see the odd news article come out, people talking on the forums about card and balance changes, so giving you a little bit of understanding as to what they are, why they come up in card games, and what they actually mean. So in collectible card games and trading card games that are out there, paper versions, things like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon and similar, naturally it's all physical product, and you'll be buying your booster packs like you buy football stickers if you're over here in the UK, American football stickers, baseball cards if you're over in the US, or similar things like that. And in trading card games, you will have rule sets, you'll have different expansion packs, and every now and then you'll get something that, because it's a physical product, the creators of the game make, and then actually in competitive or in organised play it turns out to be a little bit overpowered. Now in that kind of game, obviously you can't immediately print a new set, there's cost involved in that, so you'll change the rulings a bit. Sometimes cards will be banned from tournaments, or sometimes rule sets will change, which mean that those cards can't be used anymore. Generally they then have to wait for the next expansion of the card game to come out, or a big thing like changing of a rule set, before they can then make that sort of an as intended kind of change. Of course, the massive advantage with the digital card game is that no such thing has to be done. You can simply go ahead and change that card right away. And as a result, you can make some very quick on-the-fly changes to balance, to the gaming balance, what happens and similar. So whenever you see an article or something on the forums about Hearthstone patch changes, card changes, balance changes, there'll always be a set of notes, and within that set of notes they'll detail, if they're doing a very thorough job, exactly what the changes are to the cards, which they'll always do, and then they'll go ahead and give you a little bit of reasoning why. So let's jump in and just have a quick look at a few of the cards that are getting a change in this most recent patch. So I'm just going to jump straight into Hearthstone. I'm going to be doing this just in my collection, and we'll go through a bunch of the cards that are having some changes and just quickly discuss what Blizzard have changed these for, what their logic is, and why. So at this moment in time, the patch hasn't actually gone through, so what we're looking at is the current version of the card, shortly before the patch on the Hearthstone client goes through and Blizzard tweak it to make it the new version. So first up we have Unleash the Hounds. Now Unleash the Hounds is an interesting one, because if you've been keeping track of Hearthstone over the last couple of months, this card has already gone through one change, and the last change that Blizzard gave it was to make it a little bit less effective than it was before. Now Unleash the Hounds is a hunter card, as you can see, and it gives, for each enemy minion, summon a 1/1 hand with charge. So if I've been swept on the table, if I'm playing a Murloc deck, if I'm playing some kind of swarm deck, or perhaps if it's in the late game and my opponent's got a lot more minions down than me, then I as a hunter can suddenly summon a bunch of 1/1 hands with charge. Maybe I can start trading cards away, try and get the minion count on the table back in my favour. Now Blizzard are actually making this card a little bit easier to use. It's now got a 2 mana cost. As you can see, that's down from the 4 that it is right now. Blizzard's justification for this in the patch notes was Unleash the Hounds was intended to give hunters their own form of AoE, which stands for Area of Effect. If you're not massively into card games or haven't played World of WarCraft or similar such games, an AoE or Area of Effect spell or kind of ability is to generally lets you hit multiple targets at the same time. I think that's the best and easiest way of summing it up. So if you summon lots of 1/1 hounds with charge, then you can, in the same turn as you play all of those minions, use them to do various kinds of damage as you see fit. And also, they wanted Blizzard wanted it to have synergy with other beast cards, but the old cost that they gave it, the 4 mana, given the new tweaks that they've made, they found was a bit too prohibitive. So what does this mean? If you're a hunter, suddenly for 2 mana, this card is once again, as it used to be, very appealing. And Unleash the Hounds, you would get in a hunter deck archetype, which was, it wasn't a 1-turn knockout, but sometimes if you got lucky, you could get a 1-turn knockout with an old hunter rush deck. I will try and get a deck list up on the website, so you can take a look at that. But Unleash the Hounds in its old form, with some hunter cards that buff your minions and buff your beasts, effectively meant that you could drop a bunch of dogs, unleash the hounds as it were. You've got to imagine your finest Mr. Burns, unleash the hounds. If you've seen that particular old episode of The Simpsons, you'll know what I mean. But anyway, Unleashing the Hounds, you could drop that card, you could buff all your minions up pretty quickly with some of the hunter unique cards, and then suddenly you had a bunch of hounds on the deck. They could be doing untold amounts of damage in one go, and hunters could really come out the gate very strong. In the early game they could clear boards and do some pretty powerful stuff, which is why Blizzard originally tweaked it back a couple of patches ago. So we may see some more hunter decks coming back in, or hunter decks that are already working around that rush beast theme. We might see them once again coming back a bit more chunky, because the mana cost of that is a little bit cheaper, so that'll be good for you hunters out there. The next one is an interesting one, and as you can see from my typing, I don't actually have Pyroblasts, confession, so we'll jump in and take a look at my top little tip for you new guys. Go into crafting mode, and then everything is visible, everything is searchable, even if you haven't crafted it yet. So Pyroblast, as you can see, Pyroblast, the mage epic card, 10 damage in one go, and at the moment you can see it's 8 mana. Now, for you newer guys and newer gals, Pyroblast, there are forms of mage decks out there which you may well have seen already, but if you're a new player, that revolve around lobbing a lot of spells around. Now you can see the obscene amount of damage that Pyroblast does, and one of the synergies in the mage card set is that a lot of the mage minions will allow spells to be cast for cheaper, for less mana, or they will perhaps buff the amount of spell damage that a spell does, and there are also neutral minions that do that too. So some mage decks, and the mage has been the subject of a bit of focus from Blizzard recently. Last patch they changed the freeze mechanics a little bit, so this is another interesting one. Some mage decks really revolve around just doing 10 damage, getting to that 10 damage and keeping whatever the mage is playing against that deck in control. So controlling their opponent, doing some damage to them, and then as soon as they get to the late game, out comes Pyroblast, 8 mana, 2 turns. If you've got 2 Pyroblast in your hand, 20 damage, unless there's some healing going on, unless there's some other shenanigans that you can sort of pull off, then pretty much that 20 damage in late game for 16 mana over 2 turns is pretty killer, and the mage already has a very powerful set of tools in its armoury. Chances are that a mage is going to be able to control the table if played right, and of course, because this is a trading card game, they have a bit of luck up until that point where they can drop a Pyroblast and really just start going to town. So Pyroblast, in terms of Blizzard's terms, is now 10 mana. It's just like the mind control change to priests, and it's gone up from the original mana cost to now 10. So Blizzard's patch note on this one was 8 mana Pyroblast made for an uninteractive experience, quote unquote, where the mage only needed to do 10 damage during the course of a game and then double Pyroblast you for the win. Generally, if you can tell when you're playing a mage deck if that's what they're trying to do. They're not going to be doing too much to you in the early game. They'll be trying to control you. You may see a few fireballs come out, a few spell damage cards, but there's a very popular sort of mage archetype recently called Mage Giants, which focuses around keeping damage off of you whilst setting yourself up for those Pyroblasts. Blizzard saw this as a trend, and they want mages to be more interactive with the opponent to achieve victory rather than delay the game until they can Pyroblast. And delaying the game until they can Pyroblast is of course referring to using the various freezes, Frost Novas, Cone of Colds, Ice Lances, you name it, all of those freezing, doing bits of damage techniques that mages have in their spell armoury at this moment. So it will be interesting to see. I don't think it's going to nerf that kind of mage style. It's certainly not going to stop people from playing that kind of mage deck, but what it will do is just slow it down a little bit. So it will give whoever's playing against the mage a couple more turns to heal themselves, try and counter the Pyroblast. It will still be a bit of a race against time, and the mage freeze mechanics, the free spells that a mage has, are still very, very strong. So much like Mind Control with Priest, let's see what it does to the whole metagame. But if you're playing mages, then they're going to be a little bit slower, bringing out their big hitter. It still does 10 damage. Adding an extra 2 mana is not going to change that. So the next card that we have up is the Blood Imp. Now, the change to the Blood Imp is, as you can see at the moment, it's 1/1/1. It is now 0/1. It does no attack, and it has also had a little change to this card. So if you drop this Blood Imp, and Blood Imp is a Warlock card, your other minions have +1 health, and then because it's stealthed, it can't be directly focused in an attack. Now, if I tried to cast a spell on this card, or I tried to attack it with one of my minions, stealth negates it for you new players. I couldn't do it. But what it does not protect the card against is general area of effect AoE spells. So if I use something like a Holy Nova as a priest that does 2 damage to all opposing minions, that would kill off this Blood Imp. Just a quick note. So from this quite chunky card that for next to no mana is hard to attack and buffs all of the health of your minions, it's now 0/1, so it has no attack damage, and it now reads Stealth. At the end of your turn, give another random friendly minion +1 health. So there's another card, a neutral card called the Temple Priestess or something like that. I'll have to double check what it's called. But it now has the same effect as that card. It will give another minion 1 health. That is quite a chunky change from this current version that we see, where it just gives a global, and by global buff I mean a one that applies to everything on your side of the table. It will now only buff 1 minion per turn for 1 extra health, rather than just giving every minion on your side of the table an extra health of the board. So it's a bit of a down tune for the Blood Imp, and Blizzard's reasoning was Warlock has 3 very strong 1-cost minions, and that made the Warlock Rush deck, which is a bit of an archetype at the moment. I've seen a few of them coming up, slightly stronger than we were comfortable with. Now, if you've seen one of our previous Hearthstone Half Hour episodes, then you will have seen that Warlocks generally have some pretty good low-cost mana cards in the early game for the exchange of some kind of negative effect, be it doing damage to themselves, discarding a card and similar. So rushing with a Warlock is very viable, and the Blood Imp just makes all of that rushing, all of those low mana cost cards a lot more survivable in its current form. So interesting. I've not seen huge amounts of Warlock decks, but then again, I'm not getting to the higher echelons of play. I'm somewhere mid to high at the moment, I'd probably say. In terms of ladder, certainly. A professional I'm not. But you do see a few Warlock Rush decks kicking around, so obviously Blizzard can see all the stats. Maybe they think it's more significant, maybe it's more widespread than you can see as a player. But that is the practical effect of anyone trying to rush with a Warlock. You're going to be slightly less strong if you use Blood Imps in the early game. Next card up on the balance check list, and we're going to have to go back into crafting mode. No, we're not. We've got it. Is the Warsong Commander. Now, the Warsong Commander is such drama. If you do like the little bits of flavour text that Blizzard do. But the Warsong Commander in Warrior Land gives your other minions charge. Now, why is that brilliant? Well, dropping one of those for 3 mana, chuck down another bunch of minions, and suddenly, as a warrior, you've now got an Unleash the Hounds style effect where you can suddenly bring a huge amount of minions into play, and it's your other minions. There's no restriction on this iteration of the card whatsoever. So let's say it was late game and I dropped a Warsong Commander, I could drop a 6 or 7 mana very strong minion, and it could attack first turn without having charge. So whether you're rushing with lots of small minions, wanting to draw one very big minion late in the game as a warrior, Warsong Commander is pretty good. It's 3/2/3, so like a lot of cards in this 3 mana sort of range, it sacrifices an attack for a good ability. You do have some 2 mana cards that are 3 attack and 2 health, so it has that little inbuilt sacrifice, but still very strong, particularly if used in a few warrior decks. So Blizzard's little tweak here. Now this card reads, whenever you play a minion with 3 or less attack, give it charge. That's quite a down tune of this card. It sort of really prevents a few of those effects that I just gave, and really, if it's 3 attack or below, whenever you play a minion, then it is effectively making Warsong Commander now only a card that you can use to hurry up when you're playing decks with sort of lower mana costs and all that kind of thing. So there's also been a little bit of a change to the charge in general, and it's the charge spell that we're looking for here. Let's go to... I've forgotten what a warrior symbol looks like. Where has it gone? Charge the ability. I have lost it. It is no good. Imagine yourself some light music when we hunt down charge. I cannot find it. Maybe it's because it's not been earned. I don't know. Charge. No charge. But the actual spell of charge, rather than the keyword, has been changed, and it now costs 3 mana. And the card's new power reads, give a friendly minion +2 attack and charge. So that combined piece basically means Blizzard's keyword justification for it was both of these cards were key components in one turn kill or OTK. You may have heard me talk about OHKO, one hit KO. OTK is very similar. So, as it states, somewhat obviously, one would hope, but for anyone new out there, one turn kill, a deck that can wipe your opponent off the board in just one turn. But the important thing about these cards is that Blizzard felt that you didn't need any cards on the board to start with, so you could drop a Warsong Commander and then suddenly drop the rest of your minions. They want the game to be about playing minions and fighting for board control rather than just waiting until you can play your big combo and win in one turn with no interaction from your opponent. It's quite interesting that in these patch notes we've twice seen the word interaction from Blizzard. So they want both players to almost be working, by the sound of that. They want both players to be doing stuff, reacting to each other, rather than soaking up damage and waiting for a killer combo. So we saw in the Mage Pyroblast change, they wanted mages to be more interactive with their opponent, e.g. not just sitting there and waiting to pull Pyroblasts. And here they're trying to almost tone down a little bit any one big combo, one big win combos. So that will change a couple of archetypes a little bit. So interesting warrior changes there. Next is a card that I will definitely be able to find, and it is the Abusive Sergeant. Now, the Abusive Sergeant is a neutral minion, so this chap does turn up in a few different decks. You see at the moment he's 1/2/1, so he's got reasonable attack, and then he has a battle cry of just buffing a minion with 2 attack for 1 turn, so that's pretty good for a 1 mana drop. Now, this battle cry gives a minion plus 2 attack until the end of the turn. So they've given this a bit of a tweak to now match Dark Iron Dwarf and to give it some additional versatility. Now, I guess, friendly minion to attack this turn, giving a minion to attack this turn. I guess you could buff your opponent's minions if you really wanted to. Off the top of my head I can't think where that would be useful, but in Hearthstone there are always ways where doing strange things to your opponent's minions can occasionally give you a bit of an advantage, so I'm not going to be so bold as to say that that is silly. And how this syncs in with Dark Iron Dwarf, we can see the current version of Dark Iron Dwarf, battle cry, give a minion 2 attack, period, 4/4/4, 4 health, 4 attack, and 4 mana cost. A pretty solid card, nothing solid in terms of a 4 mana drop, but that battle cry of a permanent buff of 2 attack, very solid. And you'd see Dark Iron Dwarf drop into a lot of decks in terms of anything that involves buffing minions or beefing up some minions in your deck. A Dark Iron Dwarf was certainly, if not a deck staple for every deck, in certain kinds of deck you kind of just had to grab this card. Blizzard's justification, they wanted to reduce the Dark Iron Dwarf's overall power slightly, and they wanted to make the battle cry effect the same as Abusive Sergeant, so as to not to force you to permanently buff one of your opponent's creatures. That's true. Being forced to buff one of your opponent's creatures, I do understand that, in that they're now dropping it until the end of turn. However, I think a lot of people use this just to buff up their own minions. Occasionally as a priest, and this is where I will say I've now just thought of that example with the Abusive Sergeant. If I buff one of my opponent's minions, it might get them into the range of one of my spells. So let's take Shadow Word Pain for a priest. It will knock off a minion who is 3 attack or below, and Shadow Word Death will knock off a minion who is 3 attack or above. So if you have something like the Dark Iron Dwarf that is 4 attack, then 2 of my priest spells are useless. However, if I buff my opponent's minions, I can get them into kill range for one of my other spells by making them above 5 or below 3. If there was something that debuffed their attack, for example, and I know there are Paladin cards and similar out there that reduce your attack, for example. So that's an interesting one. They've kind of downpowered it, but they've also wanted to match it with Abusive Sergeant and some similar other cards. So that temporary buff, I would only temporarily buff or permanently buff one of my opponent's minions for a very, very, very good reason. And that priest example I gave you is one situational example where that can actually work out okay. It can, for the cost of another card, let you kill something off. So that is the Dark Iron Dwarf. Maybe it will be a little bit less featured, I don't know, in some decks that require buffing a few minions. The next one is a very understandable one, and for any of you new guys out there, this is a great example of a tweak. So this is the Defender of Argus. Now, he is a rare. He is a neutral rare. but you can see that he is a really strong card when you take a look at him. 4 mana, 3 attack and 3 health, so not massively chunky in terms of direct attack power, but still very strong. And then this battle cry, give adjacent minions +1/1 and taunt, so you create 2 slightly buffed tanks by dropping the Defender of Argus. And there are not many decks in which this, either one or two of these cards cannot be useful. If you buffed up a bunch of low health minions, drop an Argus, and you've suddenly got 2 minions with a bit more health who can tank a bit of damage off you. Whether you're playing a low minion decks, high minion decks, you're playing big minion decks in the late game and you want to change your big hitting minions into tanks for 4 mana, just really, really strong. And creating 2 tanks causes a lot of problems in some decks where you've got to fight your way past those tank minions. It will buy you time, this card. Now what Blizzard are doing to this is dropping it to a 2 attack and 3 health, down from that 3 attack and 3 health. So they're making him a little bit less of an offensive threat. Their patch notes: Defender of Argus was a card that found itself automatically included in many decks due to its power and stats, as I've just outlined. We want players to have an option as to what cards they put in their decks, so cards that feel that they must be in all decks, especially neutral ones, are not ideal. So they're trying to make it a little bit less appealing. Tuning it down to 2 attack, you will attack with this card. You could use this card to help in trades. Once you've used its battle cry, you generally try and attack with it and attack something, so that's making it just that little bit less effective. So will it work? I still think a lot of people will play this card. It's still got a really strong ability, and the ability is one of the key things that I certainly have used it for in decks. So with that in mind, an example of a powerful card and how Blizzard try and tweak it, we'll have to see whether that actually means it's any less prevalent or not. But for all you new players out there, Defender of Argus, give it a go in your deck. If you can craft it, or if you pull it in a booster, give it a go. Even with 2 attack and 3 health, still a very, very, very good card. And the next one will be familiar to, I would hope, a whole bunch of you out there. The Novice Engineer. You can see this in, because it's a basic card, you see it in a lot of the starting decks, and probably needs no introduction to you, but the Battle Cry of Draw a card is very widely used. Play a Novice Engineer for 2 mana, draw yourself an extra card in the early game. Maybe you'll do some damage for the 1 damage and 2 health, maybe you won't. It probably dies a couple of turns after that unless you buff it up, but it's played so that you can draw more cards. It is a draw mechanic card. You're playing a card game, the more cards you can draw, the better. The Novice Engineer is actually being dropped by Blizzard down to 1 attack and 1 health, down from 1 attack and 2 health. Patch notes: the Novice Engineer was played in most non-rush decks, and even some rush decks due to its cost and power. Similar in reasoning to our Defender of Argus change, we want players to have an option of what cards they put in their decks. Now, I'm not entirely sure about that sentence from Blizzard. You've always got an option not to play a card. These cards are strong, you see them in a lot of decks, but it's not be-all and end-all if you don't play them. There are some other options you can still use for draw power that aren't this one, but this one is quite strong. So I understand where they're coming from. What this will mean is that the Novice Engineer will just die a turn earlier, and it would only ever do 1 damage anyway. As soon as a Novice Engineer has been played, most of the time I think, right, that's a nuisance, I need to get off the table at some point or another, but the damage has already been done and that my opponent has played it and drawn a card, so that 1/1 will just make it a little bit easier to knock off the table rather than the 2 health, where you'd have to use a different minion to trade against it. So it will allow it to be removed from play easier. Whether it will, again, like the Defender of Argus, see it being featured in less decks, we'll have to wait and see. And the next card that we've got up is quite an interesting one. You'll see many arguments about what legendary should I draft first, what should I craft first if I'm a new player and I'm saving up my dust. Sylvanas Windrunner, and we'll probably talk about that kind of particular topic because it's a great one for a little video later in our series. Sylvanas Windrunner comes probably top or second top out of many people's lists for the minion I should draft first, the legendary minion that I should craft first if I'm going to craft one. And as you can see, with my humble 775 dust, saving up 1,600 dust can take a bit of time. I went on a bit of a rare crafting spree that I probably shouldn't have done to bulk up a couple of my decks. But taking a look at Sylvanas in her current form, 5/5/5, so the mana, attack and health all pretty much solid. I'd probably sort of, as a rule of thumb, if they're all sitting around that mark, it's good or slightly average for the mana cost. But look at that death rattle. Take control of a random enemy minion. Now, why people argue that this is a really strong overall legendary is that it forces your opponent to do something about it. Is it the late game and they've got big, hard-hitting minions out? If you drop a Sylvanas, not only are you going to do a bit of damage, she will take a bit of killing, but as soon as she drops, who knows what you're going to get off your opponent. It could be something terrible, it could be something very, very important, like if you pulled a Ragnaros or a big tanking minion with 10 health or something similar. So unpredictable, yes, but because for the mana cost it forces your opponent to change their game plan, a lot of people use it to disrupt as well, and if played with very good timing, it can be really, really dangerous. So Sylvanas Windrunner, in our final card that's getting a bit of a tweak, she's now got a slightly higher mana cost, so you will see Blizzard, if they just want to slightly tinker with the card, they will have a little tweak of mana cost or maybe health, and the advantage of a digital card game, as we explained earlier and at the beginning of the episode, is that you can literally just do the little tweak and then study the gameplay data, see what happens. It's not big printing costs and similar things. So, Blizzard's patch notes. Sylvanas had power and stats that made it a bit too powerful compared to other 5-cost cards, which made it automatically included in many decks. We want players to have an option of what cards they put in their decks. We've seen that twice before in these patch notes. So, cards that feel like they must be in all decks, especially neutral ones, are not ideal. So, in using that sentence 3 times in 3 different cards, I do understand that we can clearly see that Blizzard don't want people forced to use particular cards. However, from looking at the more competitive sort of, if there is one at the moment, the higher end of the ladder and some of the competitive tournaments we've seen, Windrunner is not an automatic pick. It will get sideboarded, and by sideboarding, it's a term from Magic the Gathering and similar, where certain tournaments will let you change the cards in your deck, providing you declare them between games, perhaps, between rounds, or sometimes even between games within a round against the same opponent. So I could have a deck of 30 cards if this was Hearthstone, and this mechanic doesn't work in Hearthstone, and then I could have 6 cards on the side that I could switch in or out for individual cards in my deck. And that is teching, that is being able to tweak things against a particular deck, give yourself options and so forth. So again, a lot of people did play Sylvanas for, and still will, I'd imagine, for the flexibility that she gives, but she is played more for the death rattle. Now, I will admit, at 5 mana, dropping her at 5 mana is a very, very strong play, and whether you save her for late game or drop her at that stage, it is a strong play. Was she forced to be in a lot of decks? No, there are several ways that she can be countered by a lot of different decks. For example, you can, if you're playing smart, you can make sure that you only have bad minions on the table when Sylvanas dies, and by doing that, your opponent might take control of a very low attack, worthless minion, for example. So there are options to deal with her. Again, Blizzard can see the gameplay data, so maybe she is in a lot of decks. From my one perspective, I can't exactly tell. So that'll be an interesting one again to have a look at. I don't think she'll be dropped from decks. I think again she's pretty powerful, but that 1 mana cost does mean that she will come into play a little bit later than she normally would, and in certain matchups a 1-turn difference can be the difference between them having an effect and someone being set up one more time. Although it may sound as though we're downplaying some of these changes, small tweaks can have very, very big effects. So one thing that will be very interesting to do is get back into the ladder and seeing after the patch. I'd imagine it's going through in the US at the moment. We are based out of GMT in the EU, as you can probably tell by the accent, so maybe our patch won't be until later this evening GMT time, perhaps tomorrow a bit more into the 14th. So that is the last card. Sylvanas Windrunner, for you new players, is still a very, very strong legendary, along with Ragnaros, probably one of the first 2 you might draft, unless you've got a specific deck you're going for, and you really want to specifically craft a particular legendary that really works with your favourite deck that you're playing, in which case ignore me and do that. But the topic of which legendary you should craft first has been covered on a lot of sites and blogs, but we'll do a little video on it at some point and review the legendaries, what they are and what they do and how they can be used. A nice little Hearthstone half hour there. So that is the end of this, our 15th episode. And just to recap what we've been through, today is the 13th of January 2014, and Blizzard have announced what they say in their own words will be the final set of big balance changes before they go live. They, quote, plan to make very few card changes and only if they're absolutely necessary, which is fine. As we explained at the beginning of the episode, you do need to tweak the game, and as soon as they start releasing expansion packs, and let's be honest, that has to happen at some stage or another, it's a card game, it's a video game, and to keep the card pool fresh and add more stuff in, it would be silly if they didn't. So being able to tweak the rules as you go along, very, very important. So let's watch with interest to see what all of these card changes bring. I hope that if you're new players watching this, you've got some idea of how Blizzard tweak cards, and for these particular cards, some of the effects that they might have on some decks that you may or may not have seen doing the rounds in casual mode, or particularly if you've jumped into laddered mode at all, or maybe if you're in the arena and you see some strange cards, what those cards actually do. And then also, if you're trying to build your first constructed decks as a new player, these are examples of cards that if Blizzard or the community feel that they need a change, then they're clearly being played a reasonable amount. So hopefully as a new to intermediate player, you would have seen some popular cards and perhaps got some ideas to how you could use them in your own decks. For you intermediate and slightly more advanced players out there, I hope this was a nice factual update, along with a few opinions as to how or how not these small changes may affect the metagame and how people craft their decks right now. So I shall drop out into the final bit of screenage. As always, thank you very much for tuning in. Really appreciate you watching these videos, be that on YouTube, felcraft.org or twitch.tv live. So as always, my final ask, if you enjoyed, please rate, please comment. We are twitter.com/felcraftcasts, youtube.com/felcraftcasts also, and if you want to tune in live, twitch.tv/felcraftcast. No S on the end of that one. And the website is felcraft.org. Stay tuned. In our upcoming episodes, we will probably jump back into the ladder. We've been saying that we'll do that for a while, and also do a few more arenas. We've noticed that you guys really appreciate, certainly seem to be viewing, whether you appreciate them or not, our how to build deck series and looking at drafting decks from a new player's perspective. So we'll get right back into that. As always, anything you think we could improve, content you'd like to see more of, please get in contact with us at one of those methods just mentioned. Or if you're not such a fan or feel as though we could really improve a few things, again, please let us know. We're happy to have constructive criticism as long as it helps us make better content for you out there.